facility, this platform, we'll be able to see those numbers increase up to 22% from the current 15 or so percent that we're currently witnessing. As we have been doing at the start of every session here at the Intra-African Trade Fair 2018, we've been telling you about some of the deals that have been taking place, that have been signed behind the scenes, because remember, the goal is that there will be $27 billion in deals and transactions signed here in Cairo before we even begin talking about the other trade deals that are taking place outside, and that will continue to take place in the years and months ahead. So let me tell you those that we have so far. We have got Theology. Now, Afreximbank and Theology signed a $251 million leverage acquisition finance facility. This for the acquisition of a 100% equity stake in emerging markets telecommunication services limited, which has been referred to as 9 Mobile, and this at an estimated cost of $301 million. Also, Orascom Investment Holdings, Afreximbank and Orascom Investment Holdings signing a $170 million intra-African investment finance facility. The facility amount will be available to Orascom to make investments across Africa in food and agro-processing sectors. The third one is Dawandel Platinum. This is in Zimbabwe. This consists of a $507 million project financing for a greenfield mining project aimed at developing the Dawandel Platinum Group Metals deposit, which is part of the Great Dyke PGM mineralization zone in Zimbabwe. The fourth one and last one that I'm going to announce here today is A-Star Textile, and this is in Burkina Faso. A-Star Textile Burkina Faso, which is a joint venture between the government of Burkina Faso and ICA Textile Sanai, the Tikaret AS of Turkey, have mandated the African Export-Import Bank to arrange a syndicated project finance facility and consider providing a portion of the total facility amount. The amount we're talking about here is $340 million. So those numbers continue to stay up, and we're hoping that there will be more by the time the fair ends next week on Monday. Okay, so let me introduce our next session, which is on understanding policies and legal framework for intra-African trade facilitation. For that conversation, I have got with me here on stage David Luke. He is the coordinator of the African Trade Policy Center, Regional Integration and Trade Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. David, thank you for coming.
Thank you too, Godfrey. I'm delighted to be here.
David, I think I wanted to begin by referring to a conversation that I had with a young lady yesterday. She is 31, if I remember correctly. She is CEO of a company that produces fruit. And she railed yesterday, and I'm using the word advisedly, she really was unhappy about the fact that she is unable to get her product into other African countries. She mentions countries in West Africa, Burkina Faso, Ghana, etc., where she wants to get in. But she finds it frustratingly difficult to get into those countries. And yet she says when you compare it with the ability to get into European countries, it becomes real easy. And I was thinking, actually, she should be in this session, because what she's fighting against, what she's running into, are the rules and regulations that govern trade across the African continent. And anyone who has done the Beibridge South Africa-Zimbabwe border will know it can be frustrating. So let's talk about how we get this going. When the African Continental Free Trade Area was announced, many people had the hope that this would finally lay to rest all these challenges, all these frustrations that business people face when they try to cross. I want you to begin by simply defining trade law and the policies that accompany the movement of goods across countries.
Well, thank you, Godfrey. Firstly, as you were talking, I was looking at my notes here because, you know, what the lady said to you is reflected in the data that I have, the statistics that we ourselves collect through surveys of the issues around cross-border trade, cross-border trade facilitation, and so on. So let me just give you one statistic, because you know this lady is represented in the statistics. As economists, we of course want to look at the global picture. We do that through data,
yes.
And you're telling us a live story, but it's represented in the statistic. We undertook a survey of trade facilitation and what we call paperless trade. That is the extent to which you don't need to go through the bureaucracy, shoveling paper around, but you can do things electronically. So we took a survey and we put the figures together. And in 2017, what we found is that Africa south of the Sahara is lagging behind in terms of implementation of a number of trade facilitation indicators. We found the figure to be 51.4%.
Sure.
The global average is 60%. And then for Latin America is 68%, Southeast and East Asia is 63%, and Europe and North America is 78.5%.
Sure.
So basically, the reason for citing you this data is simply that this lady that you talked to, who was railing, is reflected in this data. We are lagging behind on this continent. There's no question about that. And there are several reasons for this. One, of course, is the infrastructure. We're lagging behind cross-border infrastructure. As you know, a lot of effort is being made to improve the situation, but we still have some way to go. Secondly, our love for bureaucracy and controlling what comes across the border. What you tend to find is that on both sides of a border, a trader has to go through the same formalities.
Yeah.
On one side, you go through everything: customs, immigration, health checks, sanitary, phytosanitary issues. The other side of the border, you go through exactly
the same thing.
The same thing again, where we could combine, we could collaborate and streamline the process for traders to be able to move freely. One other aspect of all of this is that it tends to promote informalization.
Yeah. And
because
corruption, I have to add.
Well, corruption, informalization, etc. Because when you have all these controls, what tends to happen is that a trader, to circumvent some of these problems, might prefer to do business on a small scale. The opportunity may be there to grow the firm, the business, but just the hassle, and just wants to, do things on a small scale and minimize the. So these are real problems. I'm sure you want to talk about the solutions as well.
I do. That's why we are all here.
Yeah.
And I am hoping that you're going to tell me that the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area and the other regional bodies that we've also seen coming up and that are dotted around the continent are part of the solution, yes?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And in Africa especially, the whole question of border management is extremely important. We have 55 countries on this continent. We have 107 borders. If you look at the map.
Thank you.
And you try to look to see how many borders are there between countries. We have 107. This is the highest for any continent on the planet. So it does mean that we need to govern border, cross-border trade, cross-border arrangements better.
Yeah. And
yes, already we've made a lot of progress in the existing regional economic communities at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. We publish every 2 years what is known as the African Regional Integration Index, where we look at a number of indicators.
Yes, I remember. I was there the launch. I remember that very well.
And overall, what we have, the last publication shows EAC, that's the East African Economic Community, coming out on top in terms of cross-border formalities and trade facilitation, etc. But even EAC still also has issues that it still has to deal with, including infrastructure in the main trade corridors, including also better arrangements for formalities, better use of electronic systems, which streamline these processes.
And what was that a function of, David? What caused that improvement? Was that the creation of the EAC itself?
Well, yes. This is just my illustration that the RECs are doing. I've been trying to grapple with this problem.
Yeah.
We have not arrived there, and it's only by illustration to say that compared to other situations on the continent, EAC
it is better.
Is ahead, yeah. But we clearly have challenges, and under the Continental Free Trade Area, there are 3 specific annexes in the Protocol on Trading Goods that deal with these issues.
Okay.
And if you permit me, I'll just
Please.
I'll just elaborate a bit on these
Please.
3 annexes. You have an annex on trade facilitation and transit cooperation. The transit cooperation part has to do with the fact that 16 African countries are landlocked. So part of that annex is providing a number of provisions to ensure the free passage of goods through the coastal states of the landlocked countries.
Right.
And that's very important. The trade facilitation part is actually mostly borrowed from the WTO, which is a good thing because that's global best practice.
Sure.
In fact, I would say it's even WTO plus because the negotiators, in their wisdom, recognize that trade facilitation is a challenge on the continent and took the WTO agreement, which, as I say, is global best practice, as obligations which the state parties to the AFCFTA would have to fulfill as part of being part of the AFCFTA and benefiting from its other provisions. And when I say it's WTO plus, it goes further in areas like customs cooperation, how, recognizing the realities on the ground, how countries that are doing better could support those that are doing less well.
Sure.
I would mention the EAC situation, for example. So there's provisions on customs cooperation. Then there's the annex on customs administration itself, which again has a number of provisions, including for cooperation among customs authorities to avoid this business of going through 2 systems on both sides of the border. It also includes, as I said earlier, cooperation in terms of best practices, transferring those to other countries so that they could benefit from that. Then the third provision has to do with non-tariff barriers. This is where, issues of corruption and so on, where the agreement provides for the reporting of issues at the border which a trader finds frustrating, like the lady you mentioned.
Plus the drivers themselves, of course.
So there'll be what we call an NTB mechanism, where you can, these days, of course, using mobile telephony, you can report that such and such is happening at such and such a border. Actually, this is already happening in East Africa. So this is borrowing from East Africa good practice.
It sounds very good, David. It really sounds good. But I am thinking, and what you're telling me is that key to all of this is political will. Because when you go back and you look at the cooperation that's required, for instance, to be able to get the border authorities to cooperate so that you don't have an importer or exporter dealing with the same thing on both sides of the border, you're talking about the ability of those authorities to be talking to each other. How much of that is contained within the FCTA framework to enable it to be removed or at least dealt with?
The best way to answer this is, in my opinion, what the FCFTA is going to do for this continent is to usher in a new era of trade governance on this continent. We've talked about political governance and so on. Let's also talk about trade governance. So it's not just a question of political will, it's also a question of the institutional arrangements, how these legal provisions are actually implemented. Now, where I think the FCFTA would actually be a game changer is that it also has a protocol on the settlement of disputes, which is, again, best practice. Much of it
between the nations.
Between the nations. Much of it borrowed from the WTO. For the first time, a country that is found to be in contravention of its obligations under the agreement can be suspended
Oh.
from enjoying its benefits. This is an agreement with teeth. Political will is something of a nebulous concept. You have to have legal certainty, because here you're talking about trade and business.
Yeah.
So it's not just political will to put in place. This is
once you sign up, you are locked in.
Once you sign up,
Yeah.
and keep in mind that membership of the African Union does not automatically confer membership of the AFCFTA. The two things have been kept separate.
Yes.
For the African Union, members are known as member states. For the AFCFTA, the members are known as state parties.
Right.
And they're state parties because they're the ones that have ratified the agreement, which means that they have translated or turned the agreement into national law.
Right.
That's why the agreement can only come into force after 22 members have ratified.
Yes. Now, you have just answered my next question, because I wanted to know what happens to a member that commits, that ratifies, and yet does not implement. Because part of our big problem across the African continent, when you look back over the years, we've got these grand plans, but often those plans are not implemented, and often there are no consequences.
Yeah. Well, I think the negotiators of this deal, firstly looked at what is global best practice? What are the challenges on this continent? And they took all of this into account. That you can sign grand agreements and don't actually implement them, and they don't have teeth. But the negotiators wanted to make sure that that does not happen this time around, which is why, as I said, there's a protocol on the settlement of disputes. And the worst thing that could happen to a country that is in violation of its obligations is that it is suspended from the agreement, which means that it throws your whole business sector, all their planning, all their investment, everything that they're doing into uncertainty, because you're no longer part of this agreement. Your benefits have been suspended because you have been found to be in violation of obligations.
It really sounds exciting.
Yes, so that's why I was saying that this deal will actually change trade governance on this continent.
What impact will it have, though, David, in terms of, I don't know whether you guys have looked at the potential impact if you have, number one, the required number of countries ratifying the treaty, it's coming into force. What kind of an impact potentially could it have on trade between the contracting parties?
We've done some analysis at the Africa Trade Policy Center. We've done some modeling, economic modeling, which is a technique in economic analysis to try to tell you what would happen in the future.
If X happened,
yeah, exactly. It's not precise science.
Sure.
I'm not making the claim, that it is precise. It's like a Google map. The Google map can give you the lay of the land, but when it shows you a traffic light is in a particular street, it doesn't tell you that the light is red or green.
Often Uber comes to the wrong place to pick you up. And
so with those caveats, basically what we found is that overall welfare for all countries would increase. That is, if you like, GDP. For all countries would increase. And our modeling shows that the actual increase would depend on the level of ambition of the way that the modalities for liberalization of trading goods are applied. I know this is getting a bit technical, but basically, the more ambitious the liberalization, already the member states agreed to set liberalization at 90% of tariff lines, going down to zero, 90%. But the remaining 10%, because intra-African trade can be concentrated in just a few tariff lines. So depending on how that is done, our modeling results are different scenarios. But by the way, just parenthetically, the ministers agreed here that that remaining 10% will be 7% sensitive products, designated as sensitive products, and 3% as exclusions.
Right.
And these would
What are exclusions?
Exclusions means that there will be no reduction of tariffs.
Okay.
But then they also said, and this actually took on board what our analysis, that for the exclusions and sensitive products, that cannot be more than 10% of the value of imports. In other words, the trade is concentrated in a few tariff lines. What they're saying is your exclusions and your sensitive products cannot impacts more than 10% of the value of
trade.
imports in those areas.
Okay.
Yeah, so which means that you are liberalizing, but you are still protecting.
Yeah.
And, again, just to make the point that trade liberalization is a very sensitive issue, not only in Africa, but around the world.
Yeah.
Because there are winners and losers.
Sure.
There are companies which are going to struggle. There are jobs that are behind those companies,
Will be
firms.
lost.
So it's a complicated business. But that's a good outcome from this meeting. By the way, this was a decision taken here in Cairo yesterday.
Okay, by the trade ministers that we met across the hall from here.
That's a very good outcome.
Yeah.
Now, just to come back to the story,
very quickly,
finish and complete this. So our analysis shows that the more ambitious the liberalization, and now because of this decision yesterday, is quite ambitious.
Yeah.
You could have increases in exports of up to 50%.
Sure.
Yeah, in intra-African exports. And as I said, overall welfare of GDP, all countries.
Yeah, will
and
benefit.
What was interesting, the received wisdom is that it's the big countries that are going to benefit from this. We don't need to name them. But actually we found that even all countries, even the smaller countries, and because some smaller countries are starting from a low base, the impact
is going to
for
be
them is
substantial as well.
So all countries benefit. This is a win-win deal, at least according to the economic model.
Absolutely. And I was raising it because I saw a quotation here from Mr. Mukisa Kitui, Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, where he says the WTO calculates that current trade costs for developing countries are equivalent to applying a 219% tariff on international trade. So you can imagine if it does that on all developing countries, what about on Africa, which we know suffers the most from all of this? So the benefit has to be substantial.
No, Godfrey, this is the challenge. Now, once this agreement comes into force and implementation begins, the different provisions for customs cooperation, for trade facilitation, transit cooperation, non-tariff barriers. Now we need to make progress on these things. We also need to make progress on the infrastructure. I mean, we have been to some
which is why we are here.
Yeah, which is why we're here.
This is what our Flexing Bank is trying to do.
Crossings.
Yeah.
Really the facilities are very rudimentary.
Yeah.
At some border crossing. So this is going to be the work on the ground. But for that work on the ground to really take off, you need to have some kind of a legal framework that gives it the impetus. At
what level, though? Is that at state level? Is that at regional level? Is that continental?
At the state level. It's like saying that, we're putting in a democracy, but there will be no elections. So, you need something that will give it the impetus.
Yeah.
And what is going to give it the impetus is a continent-wide agreement.
So you will need to help countries, individual countries, bring up, number one, the sort of facilities we're talking about in terms of infrastructure, but also help them in terms of putting up the legal frameworks that are required to enable this to work. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, the legal framework is provided through the agreement. It's now the institutional arrangements and practices at the border level. That is what.
So it will help those countries that are behind leapfrog and
exactly.
become part of it.
Exactly.
Which
and
is
knowing
great.
that this is a legal obligation that they have taken on.
Yes.
And if they don't deliver, there are consequences.
They get chucked out. I'm really excited for February 2019 because that's when the heads of state and government are going to come and meet in Addis and decide if they've got enough numbers to enable the treaty to come into force. I wanted to go back to the idea of some of the things that are required to help improve the flow of trade. The concept that I have seen implemented across a few borders, I don't know how many, by the African Development Bank is this one-stop cross-border facility, yes, the border post. How successful has that been from your experience? And also, could that make the dent that's required here to enable the freer movement of goods?
Our survey show that it's a mixed picture.
It's a mixed picture?
Yes. In some cases, you do have some successes. Some cases you have had reversals, with cooperation arrangements being withdrawn, and so on. It's a mixed picture, which is why, and this is reflected in the data that, I cited, or even if you look at the World Bank doing business data that looks at these things, and I have on my talking notes here. If you want the data, I can cite them. Yeah, so no, clearly we do have a lot of work to do, and let me also say that the legal framework provides the certainty that countries know what their obligations are.
Yes.
It's going to take time to put in place the institutional arrangements, the practices.
Yeah.
It is the practices. It's not so much the, having a cross-border post, a one-stop border post, etc. It is now people are running them, that they are actually carrying out the processes that will make these things work. So the daily practice, that is going to be the challenge.
I need to talk about two more things, David, before we open the debate to the floor. I want to talk about how this, the creation of the AfCFTA and other trade arrangements that we see will help us with improving the flow as well for informal trade, or does it not cover it?
It does cover informal
because a lot of
trade.
African trade is informal, right?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I already mentioned to you that part of the pressure on, if you like, informalization is inadequate cross-border facilities.
Yes, and corruption.
Yes, and corruption. And by the way, this is the theme of the African Union this year, corruption. It's no longer a taboo. It's been put out up front for it to be discussed and for solutions to be found. Yes, so that's a key. Is going to be a key challenge. That we find practical solutions to these sorts of problems. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm sure many of us have got our anecdotes about the times we spend at the borders. I speak of mine, encountered at Bridge border post between South Africa and Zimbabwe, and I remember this one time, and I started counting the hours because they had been getting longer and longer each time I passed the border. I recall spending 13 hours just trying to cross the border. I didn't have any goods or services that I was doing. I was simply crossing the border. 13 hours. And it could be equally split between the two border posts, half on the South African side, half of the Zimbabwean side. And it is absolutely frustrating. So I can understand what it does to the people who are trying to trade. And more so, I know drivers of these companies that do the cross-border trade spend weeks at some of those border posts. 2 weeks is not an abnormal thing to be spending on the South African-Zimbabwean border side. I cite it because I'm hoping by shaming these kind of things, we can get some kind of progress. What about technology? Can't we use technology to help solve some of these problems?
Absolutely. And the technology is making it possible. Even here at this conference, we've had some demonstrations of new ways of tracking what is actually inside containers.
Right.
I
saw reference to a COMESA project.
Yes, I think there was one. There was another one that was from SADC, actually, the SADC region, that was cited in one of the panels I was at. So, and of course you have single windows, which is an operating system that can make you do everything online, even before you get to the border. And so all the information is there. You can have scanners also to tell you what is in the containers without stopping the trucks. And
physically inspecting the thing.
And so on. So there are many ways in which technology can help. It is beginning to make an inroad into the way border facilities are managed, but we do have some way to go. I don't want to go back to my notes to give you the data, but we do have data on these sorts of things.
No, I can encourage the people who are here, the people who are listening as well, to get in touch with you at your office. But at this point, I'd like to open up the debate, with your permission, David, to the floor, and invite you guys who have come in today to ask any questions that you may have for David. If I can ask that you raise your hand, yes, and then you also identify who you work for, and we'll get a microphone to you, and we get your question going. There should be a microphone around. There's a hand here, if we can bring the microphone to the gentleman. I've got still many questions, David. I'm sure we could spend the rest of the day here because you were talking about technology that enables you to report corruption. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that, but let's give the gentleman an opportunity.
Good morning. Thanks for your enlightening talk. My name's Helmo Preuss from the BRICS Post. David, there's an African proverb that says, when elephants fight, the grass gets hurt. Could you say what the collateral damage is between the US and China trade warfare?
The damage arising from the fight between the US and China. Slightly off topic, but I guess part of it is that we in Africa will see the consequences of that. We can take another question and then we can ask David to answer both questions. There's a hand here. Thank you, ma'am.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Agnes. I'm working currently in Dubai as one of the expats, but I'm a Filipino. I'd like to stress into points here. One is the imposition of political will to the different African countries. Since you have already mentioned that, maybe it would be likely possible that if we have political will that is being mandated in each of the African nations, then that will be possible to have a good facilitation of the trading. Now, my question is, how prepared do African nations with regards to the implementable political will? And where do you consider that in your local policies, that all African countries will be able to recognize this in unison? Because, for example, Nigeria may be having a different kind of flow with regards to importation as well as importing also to Ghana and things like that.
Sure.
With regards to the second point I'd like to raise on, and this is, sorry, I put it in the note. The customs itself. Customs, as we know, and not only in African countries, throughout the world, are very stringent and strict with regards to, clearing the cargoes, whether it will, mostly in the discharge port, and I'm talking right now in the African countries. Are there, okay, this is in consonance with the political will, yeah. But you know what, because we would like to protect the business sector as well, so how friendly we can be allowing or consenting some discrepancies that is happening in this discharge port that can be corrected and somehow able to clear up with all the goods that are being imported in each of the country, because our company, or even when we export to Ghana, for example, it's very difficult for us to negotiate with the customs, and much so they impose on higher tariffs, and this is not more likely. We'd like to see, when we are to protect the trading sector.
Yeah.
With regards to the technology, I'd
yeah.
like to see that, Africa can be the seemingly European. How they call this? You have a European paradigm, and that would more likely be give African country as a region as a very developed sector or area in the world.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think, David, you heard the questions. Yes, I don't need to paraphrase them, but I think there are difficult choices to be made that may have to be made, and they will be casualties.
Okay, firstly, I think it's Helmut, right? Yeah. Two sides of the same coin to your question. On one side, having trade in the news, trade wars in the news, almost every news bulletin today and almost every newspaper on the front page has a trade story. And believe you me, this is new because I've been working in this area for more than 25 years. First time ever I'm seeing trade get so much publicity. I think this is a wake-up call to the African leaders, and they have taken notice that if the big elephants, as you say, are fighting, then they need to wake up themselves and understand what the power of trade, what trade does. And I think you're seeing this kind of reaction on this continent. What has been achieved through the AFCFTA. Godfrey, you started this conversation by reciting, I was trying to add the figures up, but something like $6 to $7 billion that you recited this morning of deals.
Oh, the deals that were done.
The deals that were done here.
And the target that we're trying to reach. Yes.
So something is changing on this continent. I think everyone is understanding that prosperity does not come from aid, which has been a misconception for a long time on this continent, that you have to trade your way out of poverty. You have to trade your way out of unemployment. You have to trade your way out of inequalities that we have in our society. So I think there's a better understanding, and that is because of the tensions that you find globally on international trade. But on the other hand, the other side of the coin is that it is causing damage because there is so much global uncertainty. There is increased protectionism. Again, I can give you data which is available on protectionist measures that have been taken by countries as they're, looking more and more, as they say, after your own backyard, more than anything else. And it's also putting at risk, I think this is the most damaging aspect, is putting at risk the multilateral trading system. I've cited in this conversation the WTO several times, best practice, etc. Now, if you're undermining what is supposed to be the global policeman, for the system, then is putting at risk. But then again, on the other hand, for us in Africa, what it means is we cannot rely on the multilateral trading system. Let us at least rely on what we can control here. And I think that message too is getting across, and you're seeing in conversations I'm having with senior officials, ministers, that this is understood, that let's try to control what we can control.
Okay.
Now to turn to, I believe, Agnes. I did say that this deal is not simply dependent on political will. It does create a legal framework of obligations, responsibilities, as well as benefits. This is what this AFCFTA does. Because political will is it's a concept which is very hard to put into practice. Whereas, a deal which has been negotiated by the parties gives much more certainty. So from that perspective, and keeping in mind that the parties themselves negotiated this deal, and they put into it what they want in it. There is no question about that. I've given several examples, even just yesterday, this way that the ministers decided they are going to deal with the remaining 10%. This is what they want in this deal, and this is what is politically possible among the ministers. So to the extent that this is what the African negotiators have negotiated among themselves, it's not really dependent on political will. It's now the implementation will be dependent on putting into effect these obligations and responsibilities they have taken on board in the anticipation of the benefits that will flow from that. Now, specifically in regard to customs, and let me be very quick here. Firstly, I'm not surprised that from Dubai you are paying a higher tariff in Ghana, because Ghana, as far as I know, Ghana and Dubai have no preferential tariff arrangement. So I would imagine that you pay, the normal customs duties. But your point is well taken, that what we should be aiming at on this continent is to have something like what they have in Europe, where they have even almost seamless cross-border facilities. It will take time. It depends on investment, as I've said. That investment is being made on some of the cross-border facilities. Go back to what I said before, 107 unique land borders on this continent. And these unique land borders may have hundreds of border posts, cross-border posts. Because the continent is so heavily balkanized, it's going to take time for us to get there, but at least we have the framework, and at least there cannot be any rollback or reversals, because if you roll back and reverse, there's a legal dispute settlement to correct that. But it's going to take time, obviously. But we are now on the journey, and I think that's the important thing. which we were not before on this continent. Now we're on the journey.
Absolutely. And you're warming up to my theme that I've been talking about here. You know, those 107 borders that I have had for the first time, actually, I've never counted the number of borders that we have in Africa.
It's our job to count.
We know who created them, right? Yeah, some German guy in 1884. We'll leave it there. One sort of follow-up question quickly, David. Is there a monetary mechanism for the AFCTA?
Yeah. One of the annexes and the protocol on trading goods has a specific provision on non-tariff barriers. And it says in that protocol that the African Union, as part of the implementation of the AFCFTA, will set up an NTB, non-tariff barrier mechanism, for monitoring these egregious practices across borders. And different ways of doing this. I did mention that in EAC, they do have a central control system where if you're a truck driver and you're encountering problems, along your route, corruption or whatever, or arbitrary searches or whatever, there's a number you can call to say that this is happening. And in EAC, actually, we have seen from minutes of summit meetings that the presidents discuss these things among themselves. One president saying to the other, "This is what your people did to my people." This is actually happening. So they would have that system.
Okay.
And for those who are asking, what will be the role of the REX after this AFCFTA?
Yes, the regional economic communities.
That is one of the things that they would, because these are things that needs to be closer to the ground. You can only do them on the ground. You cannot do them like continentally. Absolutely. You have to be on the ground for these things to work. Yeah,
David, let's take some more questions. Yes,
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions when I'm not moderating, but anyway, I'll break protocol. David, I heard you mention...
Mark Edo.
Yes, Mark Edo, yes.
Very well known.
I heard you mention, just in answering one of the questions earlier, the first question, that you said the words, what the ministers decided yesterday, and you were referring to these ring-fenced 10% of industries and goods that are protected country to country and are not part of the 90% of tariffs that will be dropped. Now, this is something, interestingly, that private sector who have complained all from Tunisia to Nigeria, they've all complained they weren't consulted on the AFCFTA. I've interviewed many who said they watched it on TV as they saw their president signing. So there wasn't enough stakeholder dialogue, let's just say, done in some countries. I think that issue of that 10% protection, if you want to call it, of industries that are nascent, that need to be protected from outside, from duplicate goods and services coming from other economies, is not quite clearly articulated to the private sector. But that aside, my question was, unless I was mistaken, you said what the ministers decided on that yesterday. What did they decide on it yesterday?
Okay, yeah. I could
please quickly, yes. Should we take another one? Let's take another one. Is there any other question, comment on the floor? Okay, while they are making up their minds, go for it.
Yes, thanks, Mark, for that question. There's some eminent economists like Danny Roderick, Jeffrey Sachs, who have written that you need to bring the politics into the economics of trade agreements. And the reason why you have economists taking this line is that it's now better understood that the economics of a trade agreement may tell you that the more you liberalize, the better the effects. And what I cited, even our models tell us this.
Is he telling Donald Trump?
well, these are American-based economists anyway. They lead in these areas. But what has been realized is that for a trade agreement to be successful in the long term, you need to make sure that you're also protecting those who are likely to be adversely affected. And also for there to be legitimacy and consensus for the agreement, you need to bring others on board, not those who are going to benefit, but those who are going to be left behind, who are going to be adversely affected. And that is why, again, in their wisdom, the minister said, okay, we are creating a free trade area here. Actually, the WTO norm is 80%, roughly. You know, that is what the WTO requires of a free trade area.
Right.
It's not 80% drop of tariff, roughly.
And
speaking.
we're going for 90.
Yeah, we are going for 90. Now, what they have said is that what remained for them to deal with was how you then allocate the remaining 10% to sensitive products and to exclusions. Sensitive products, of course, being sectors, products which the country either is building capacity in or has very good reason to want to protect, either because of maybe food security, the vulnerable people, etc., and then exclusions to say, no, we are not dropping any tariffs on these areas. At the same time, they wanted to make the liberalization meaningful because of the low volume of intra-African trade means that the trade is concentrated in just a few tariff lines. So you can liberalize 90%, but if the trade is concentrated in 4, 5, 6% of the tariff lines, you have liberalized a lot, including maybe, just to give you an outlandish example, you have liberalized the aeronautics components. But yeah, exactly. So what they then said is, okay, 7% will be sensitive, 3% exclusion, but no more than 10% of imports, of the value of imports, should be affected in the way this is applied. So in other words, they want to make sure that you can still send what you have in the protected areas to make the deal a meaningful deal and win-win for everyone.
Yeah.
And then they have said that over a period of time, they'll phase out the 10%.
Yeah.
There's still a few issues to deal with. 1 or 2 countries, I think 3 countries actually, are still looking at how best they can apply this, let me put it this way.
Yeah.
And I believe that's been escalated to the summit.
It's a sensitive issue.
It's a sensitive issue.
Yeah.
It's a very it has to be. It has to be a very sensitive.
Yeah. Though I would say they should be concentrating on the benefits and the profits flowing from the 90% instead of worrying about the 10%.
Well, it's not that simple because if you're doing business in the 10%, you would not be thinking.
And you're affected. You'll be crying all the way to the bank. Okay. I can take a couple more questions if they are. If they aren't, let me know. And I have a few more here that I can ask. Yes, there's another hand here again. Okay. He has already asked this question. Is there another hand that I can see before we take him? Yeah? Okay, go for it.
David, can I do a follow-up on Mark's question about the 10% value? Is that dynamic? In other words, if you have a 50% increase in your trade going forward, okay, directional mark, okay. If you've got a 10% or a 50% increase in your imports, obviously then your 10% will also increase by 50%. So if you can explain, how often does that get reevaluated and who monitors that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, Godfrey. That's a very good question. Earlier I talked about a new era of trade governance on this continent.
Yeah.
In the sense also that there will be an intergovernmental process, a specific committee that will be looking at tariff issues, non-tariff barriers, by the way, trade facilitation, a whole range of areas covered by the deal. And the recognition that trade is dynamic, as you say, and things may change over time. And so they put in place an intergovernmental process where they can sit down together as a committee in a particular subject area and look at what is changing in that area, and then what now needs to be updated to respond to that. And again, this is copying the WTO, as you would recognize, because the WTO has all these committees, etc. And that's why there's also provision for Secretariat to support this committee system, and for the agreement to be headquartered in a capital where all can be implementation can be facilitated in this way.
Yeah. David, before we go, just one conversation I moderated yesterday. There was a really, how shall I say, concentrated amount of talk around standards and certification of goods and services as part of the process, obviously, of enabling, of making sure that the goods that we trade are up to a certain standard. Are there any processes that are laid out within the FCTA that cover this?
Yes, there is also an annex on cooperation on standards. Also, the African Union already has a program with the African Regional Standards Organization. By the way, parenthetically, we would have a program tomorrow with ASO here at the trade fair on standards.
Okay.
Yes, it's a big issue, it's a big challenge, not only just technical standards, but food safety standards, phytosanitary standards, etc. You know, these are huge issues on this continent that need to be dealt with.
Absolutely. David, I anticipate your time is not going to be on from the moment you walk out of here, because I'm sure there are many people who would like to tap into your knowledge. But thank you for sharing it with us today.
Thank you, Godfrey.
Thank you. Thank you. And that's it from us here in Cairo at the first Intra-African Trade Fair. Thank you. Please help me to thank you.